We have today Daniel Markey with us. Daniel Markey is a senior expert on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace. He is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute. Dr. Markey has 2 decades of academic, think tank, and government experience focused on international relations and U.S. policy in Asia, with a particular focus on South Asia and China's evolving role in the region. Daniel Markey earned his bachelor's in international relations at Johns Hopkins and his doctorate in politics from Princeton. Dr. Markey is the author of No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relation with Islamabad. We will call on Dr. Markey's expertise on Pakistan today. Many of you will recall that Dr. Markey spoke to us earlier this year on February the 8th. The title of his talk was China's Western Horizon. It dealt with evolving political, economic, and security links between China and its Western neighbors, including Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. We were so impressed by Dr. Markey that we insisted he come back. So let me tell you a little bit now about Pakistan. With American forces having withdrawn from Afghanistan, the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations is uncertain. Here is what 4 pundits are saying at this moment in time. Number 1, Pakistani leaders have to protect their national interests. We can't make them behave the way we want them to behave. Number 2, many Pakistani officials are tilted towards the West, and hence we have leverage. It is important to remember that it is on us in the USA just as much as it is on Pakistan to work out a relationship. Number 3, we now view Pakistan from a China lens. We can't wish away ties with China, so we have to ask ourselves how we can shape a productive relationship between the US and Pakistan. And the 4th and last, Pakistan is one of the few countries with high levels of access to China, European countries, and the US. We cannot ignore this. For an up-to-date view on US-Pakistan relations, we now turn the session over to Dr. Daniel Markey of the United States Institute of Peace. The United States Institute of Peace was established by Congress in 1984 as an independent institution devoted to the nonviolent prevention and mitigation of deadly conflict abroad. Thank you, Dr. Markey, for saving me when I called on you urgently to see if you would switch your date where I had a cancellation. And I said at that time, and hope Joan's not listening, I would kiss you on all your cheeks for doing that. Good to see you, and it's up to you now to take over. Take care.
Great, thanks, Don. No, I had a great time on my last visit, and I was happy to come back. As I said at that time, only unfortunate that I can't see you all in person, but this is fun nonetheless. Yeah, today I'll shift gears from the last time when I was focusing about the topic of my last book and kind of go back to the book that I wrote that you mentioned back in 2013, but in many ways much updated. It happens that I've written an article in Foreign Affairs on the relationship between the United States and Pakistan. And that's what I'm really going to focus on in my opener. And then I'm happy to take the conversation anywhere that you and others who are joining us want to take it. That article was entitled America's Perennial Pakistan Problem. And my book was titled No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tormented Relationship with Islamabad. So you can see that I've often focused on the challenges of this relationship. And there have been many challenges to focus on. In fact, just as an aside, when I first came to the US State Department back in 2003 to work in the Office of Policy Planning, they asked me what I wanted to work on, and South Asia had been an area of some interest. And when I was able to do that, people asked, why do you like it? And I said, because it's so full of challenges. You've got just about everything from interstate war, conflict, domestic conflict, terrorism, poverty, education challenges, human development challenges, political challenges and political turmoil, you name it, it's there. And that unfortunately in many ways continues to be the case. But Pakistan is also a timely issue now, not least because of the rapidly evolving situation in Afghanistan next door. As a consequence, you've had a number of diplomatic interactions between the United States and Pakistan. And that's also, I think, moving quickly. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was just in Pakistan this past week with what I'm told were some fairly challenging conversations, principally having to do with Afghanistan. And I would expect that this will continue. So what I want to do is actually walk through the article that I wrote for Foreign Affairs and kind of expound upon it a little bit. And that article is framed as an answer to three questions, questions that actually the editor of the magazine came to me with a few weeks before they ran the essay, because he felt that these were the kinds of things, sort of a first cut at history, a history of the past 20 years of US-Pakistan relations, but with a particular focus on sort of what went wrong in Afghanistan. So the three questions are simply, what role did Pakistan play in our war in Afghanistan? And to spoiler alert, not a very helpful role usually. Second question was, why, if Pakistan wasn't being as helpful as we wanted, why were we, the United States, unable to find a way for 2 decades to either push them or pull them into playing a more constructive role? And the third question is, okay, given that history, what should we draw from this for the future of US policy with Pakistan? So question one, what has Pakistan's role in Afghanistan been? The first point would be a historical one. The Taliban, our principal adversary as it came to be throughout the war in Afghanistan over the past 20 years, the Taliban would not exist if not for Pakistan's support. Pakistan was present at the creation of the Taliban and according to many sources was instrumental in helping a fledgling movement of clerics and scholars in Afghanistan get off the ground and become ultimately a potent fighting force that took down its adversaries and eventually swept into power in Kabul. When it did so in the 1990s, Pakistan also found that Taliban rule in Afghanistan served certain Pakistani purposes well. And among them, it provided a sort of a buffer between Pakistan's west in Afghanistan and a sense of Indian influence. Of course, Pakistan and India being bitter rivals and hostile toward one another at many points, if not every point, throughout their independent creation since the late 1940s. Pakistan has always been very nervous about what India might be doing, not just inside of India to prepare for conflict with Pakistan, but also what it might be fomenting inside of Afghanistan. And so with the Taliban in charge in Afghanistan and Pakistan influence over the Taliban, they felt like they could protect themselves from India. Now, some Pakistanis did this out of a genuine ideological sympathy for the Taliban. They actually believed much of what the Taliban were preaching about Islam, about a much more austere version of Islam and that practice. But many Pakistani leaders just saw this as a kind of a calculated move to keep Afghanistan out of India's hands, out of Iran's hands as well, another regional player, and to make sure that Afghanistan was controllable in a sense from Pakistan. Now, after 9/11 was the first time that the Pakistanis actually officially withdrew their support from the Taliban. And they did so only in an extreme circumstance of the threat of US war, both in Afghanistan and if Pakistan hadn't relented, potentially against Pakistan as well. So the stakes were very high in those days and weeks after 9/11. That was very clear to Pakistan's leader at the time, President Musharraf. And they quickly relented and basically renounced the Taliban, at least publicly. But while they renounced the Taliban, at the same time, within days and weeks, the Taliban found it rather easy, many of them, including senior leaders, to get across the border into Pakistan. And over the subsequent weeks and then months to regroup inside of Pakistan, in Balochistan, in neighboring parts of Pakistan, what was then the Northwest Frontier Province and the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan along the Afghan border. And from there, the Taliban gradually reorganized and began to launch what became a reasonably effective insurgency. They had Pakistani safe haven, where they were not to be attacked from US or NATO forces, at least not routinely in the way that they had been inside of Afghanistan. Pakistan never stopped providing effectively a safe haven for these groups all the way up until the present. But they also, that is the Pakistanis, also provided more direct support and training and material support and made it possible for certain parts of the Taliban, namely the Haqqani network, one of the more effective parts of the broader Taliban group, effective as a fighting force, effective against US forces, against others inside of Afghanistan. The Pakistanis supported them even more directly. And there is also evidence to suggest that the Pakistanis continued to support these groups and made the latest conquest of the Taliban nationwide over the past year or so that led up to the dramatic collapse of the Afghan government, including in Kabul. All of that was made easier by logistical intelligence support and training provided by Pakistan. So Pakistan essential to the Taliban's origins, to its survival, and then ultimately to its success militarily. Now, to be clear, Pakistan isn't the only reason for the Taliban's success. Afghanistan has been a fertile ground for insurgency for, one could say, literally in some ways, hundreds of years. And so the Pakistan did not make it that way. The government of Afghanistan, the one that had the support of the international community and especially the United States, was also rife with weaknesses of corruption, inability to provide basic services, and so on, that made an opposition to that Kabul-centered government, made that opposition stronger. And so it came in the form of the Taliban. Had it been someone else, not the Taliban, there might have been a similarly powerful opposition force. Having said that, if we imagine a hypothetical where the Taliban did not have the support of Pakistan, they probably would have been finished as an organization. They would have been hounded into hiding. They probably would not have managed to mount a resurgent or an insurgency under the Taliban banner. And remember, the Taliban were the group that provided place for Al-Qaeda and other international terrorist groups to organize and operate prior to 9/11. Had another group, another opposition force come into being in Afghanistan after 9/11, but one that did not have those ties with Al-Qaeda, one could imagine the history of the last 20 years playing out very, very differently, with the United States perhaps being more sympathetic to that opposition to the Kabul government, seeing the weaknesses of the Kabul government, and eventually pulling out perhaps earlier, perhaps with less concern about the return of international terrorists to Afghanistan. And of course, now we have that concern that the Taliban are back in power. All right, so what went wrong? The second big question. Pakistan clearly never stopped supporting the Taliban throughout all these years, But why? Well, at least some of this has to do with America's own policy and strategic failings in Afghanistan and with Pakistan. Among them, the United States, certainly when I was in government back in 2003 to 2007, we almost never in our dealings with Pakistan placed Afghanistan at the very top of our list of concerns. We were worried, and increasingly so during that period, about the resurgence of the Taliban. But what we were really worried about was Al-Qaeda, about global terrorist organizations, some of whom had relocated into Pakistan. So we were very worried about what these terrorist operatives might be doing inside and from Pakistan. So that was at the top of our agenda. And of course, Pakistan also being a nuclear armed state with a growing and fast growing nuclear arsenal, we were also concerned about what that might mean for the world and for the region. And so if you had to identify where Afghanistan fit in our list of priorities, it was also often number 3. We would raise the issue of the Taliban and Pakistan's safe haven to the Taliban later in meetings, not a first order issue. Of course, also in Afghanistan, the United States saw it, especially as we began the war in Iraq, as what was described as an economy of force mission. That is, we put a lot less attention on the war in Afghanistan than we did on Iraq. We got distracted. It was clear that we weren't prioritizing Afghanistan in the way that we ought to have. This manifested in many different ways, including an inability to recognize the threat posed by the Taliban until much later than we should have, but also an inability to respond to it or resource the government in Afghanistan in ways that would have made it more effective as a partner. So we have a lot of things that we did wrong in our relations with Pakistan and in Afghanistan. At the same time, though, dealing with the Pakistani military has never been an easy business. There's always a problem that while they were simultaneously, and the military has almost always been really in charge in Pakistan, and it was certainly the case throughout the early days in Afghanistan, while President Musharraf was in power, the military dictatorship, the United States had to deal with the Pakistani military. There was no one else. But as we dealt with them, they were always simultaneously a partner on some things, like finding and bringing into custody certain Al-Qaeda terrorists based inside of Pakistan. So they might partner with us on that, while they were also supporting other groups that we considered terrorists, like the Haqqanis. They were simultaneously the only group that we could approach to try to secure Pakistan's nuclear arsenal against threats like accidental use or terrorist attacks on that arsenal or attempts to steal from it. But they were the group that was actually building that arsenal, in many ways making the situation riskier. So they were a partner and a foe. And they were also really hard to manipulate. I mean, from an American perspective, if we wanted to, say, try to drive wedges between parts of the Pakistani army to get them, certain groups to work with us and others might be more problematic, they stood unified throughout much of this period. They were difficult to manipulate because they were more unified. And we also faced a broader problem that to really play games with the Pakistani army was risky. They were really and are the single most effective, capable, and unified national institution of the Pakistani state. If they were to fall or collapse or implode or be factionalized in any significant way, the state of Pakistan could also become destabilized in ways that for a nuclear armed state would be very dangerous for them and for us as well. So there was always the risk of pushing them too hard or too far, lest they actually collapse. At the same time, they didn't buy what we were selling, certainly not on Afghanistan. They didn't believe that what we were trying to do in Afghanistan would ever work. Some of them were outright opposed to our war in Afghanistan from the beginning for ideological reasons. They felt that the Taliban were not the evil group that we portrayed them to be. And they actually saw the United States as the problem actor in the world. And you could see this in a number of ways when President Musharraf did work with the United States, perhaps under duress, but he himself was attacked by opposition forces inside of Pakistan. Quite literally, there were a number of early assassination attempts on him, presumably by individuals within the army, within the Air Force, and who had ideological perspectives, Islamist, radicalized perspectives, and saw his cooperation, even narrow cooperation, with Washington as a problem that needed to be resolved. So we didn't convince certainly ever that part of the Pakistani state or society that what we were doing in Afghanistan was the right thing to do. But even Pakistanis who were willing to work with the United States were often and continued to be unconvinced that what we were doing in Afghanistan would ever work. They believed that we were sort of wrong-headed in our approach, that building up an Afghan state was something that was beyond the means of the United States. Even building up an Afghan national army was something that would take decades and would be beyond what Washington could ever deliver. But they also believed that the United States fundamentally did not understand Pakistan's position in Afghanistan. And therefore, they were not inclined, because the United States was not sympathetic to them, they were not sympathetic to us, and not inclined to actually do our bidding. They believed that the United States, wouldn't listen to them, and I think they had some legitimate concerns, wouldn't listen to them when they complained about Indian influence inside of Afghanistan, or when they complained that the state of Afghanistan was unwilling itself to recognize as legitimate the territorial boundary with Pakistan, and that the state of Afghanistan wanted to redraw that line to extend Afghanistan into parts of present-day Pakistan. So Pakistanis felt like they weren't being listened to either in terms of their national interests. And then the last point would be the Pakistanis believed that their strategy in Afghanistan was working. In other words, that their continued support to the Taliban would pay off over time, that the Taliban were not only legitimate, but more likely to be an effective military force inside of Afghanistan. And if they just stayed the course, that ultimately that would work for Pakistan as well. Now, that part of that logic was that they felt that they would be more patient than the United States, that they could outlast us. Part of it was also that the Pakistanis had no other very comparable and effective strategy for Afghanistan for promoting their own interests there. They had worn out their welcome with many other Afghans. They had committed atrocities and abuses over decades in terms of the Afghan civil war. Pakistan was not loved by many Afghans. And they lacked other tools, diplomatic tools, economic tools, deep pockets so that they could buy off Afghans or build up the Afghan economy in ways that might have engendered more love or at least respect. Pakistan didn't invest in those areas. So it was left with the Taliban and continued to ride the Taliban horse, so to speak, throughout the war. Other problems in terms of US efforts of trying to deal with Pakistan had to do with something that's often debated here in Washington, D.C., our leverage with the Pakistanis. How could we induce them or coerce them to do what they wanted? Even if they didn't want to do what we wanted, how could we bring them around? And this has been so debated, but ultimately these were unsuccessful. But we tried. The United States tried just about every combination of inducement and coercion. So early on, I remember when I joined the State Department in 2003, there was a lot of conversation about finally selling to Pakistan F-16 fighter jets, which had been a contentious issue because they had been denied to Pakistan in earlier decades. And now we were going to come around and sell them to Pakistan and also provide them with significant military assistance. And in doing so, the hope was that we could win over the Pakistani army again, find them as a natural partner. They would see us as a partner, and they would also see that what we were doing in Afghanistan and elsewhere made sense for their own interests as well. We provided literally billions of dollars in terms, tens of billions, of what we called reimbursements for Pakistani military operations, which was fairly flexible funding to the Pakistani military, which we expected would also repay us with their support for what we were trying to do. And it didn't fully work. And part of what was wrong with these inducements was they often came with strings attached. We would say, we're giving you this, but we expect that. So not just a generous gift by any stretch. They often came with fairly Byzantine and challenging accounting requirements that created kind of friction and irritation at the working level. And they often came in the context of broad public debates here in the United States about all the things that Pakistan was doing wrong and why we were upset with them and how they needed to change. And these debates would take place in the halls of Congress and elsewhere. And so when we provided inducements, military assistance, or even later billions of dollars in civilian side assistance to Pakistan, they would hear on the one hand how generous we were being, and on the other hand, they would also hear how frustrated we were and how much we thought Pakistan was doing the wrong thing. So that mixed message came at a political cost and at a strategic cost, I would say, in terms of the effectiveness of our inducements. Then we also tried coercion. So we weren't always just giving them things to try to win them over. Sometimes we threatened them, but we were careful about this. And we didn't do it all the time. And we certainly didn't do it in a consistent manner. So one moment of coercion worked very effectively, spectacularly effectively, and that was immediately after 9/11. I already mentioned then President of Pakistan, dictator of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, rolled over quickly on the Taliban and allowed US forces to work with Afghan opposition forces at the time to rout the Taliban, kick them out of power in Afghanistan. And Pakistan accepted this, despite having been a supporter of the Taliban for years and years before that. And they accepted it because they were worried about what would happen if they didn't. So it was clear coercion. It was threats from the US government of Pakistan becoming an enemy of the US, perhaps a target of the US military, unless they did what we wanted, including access into Afghanistan for years thereafter. So that was one successful moment of coercion. Showed that if we were really serious and we had a specific requirement, the Pakistanis would play ball. Maybe not willingly, but grudgingly. At the same time, there were at least a couple of other times when we probably had opportunities to be more coercive, but did not choose or failed to take advantage of them. One of these came in 2010. I was then out of government. I was watching as the Obama administration contemplated what it described as a military and civilian surge in Afghanistan. It was debating this, maybe you'll remember, for months and months before it actually went ahead with the plan. And it was debating whether or not to send tens of thousands of more US forces into Afghanistan to really push back against Taliban advances. And I remember at the time I was approached by Pakistanis, including official Pakistanis who were very well connected, who suggested to me that rather than the United States going forward with this surge, that this was the perfect time, with the threat of the surge looming, that coercive threat, sort of like they described it as a hammer raised and ready to pound the Taliban. With that hammer raised would be the time to seek a negotiated settlement, to use that coercive threat and use Pakistan's good offices or organizing to get the Taliban to come to the peace table and start talks then. And many of you will remember that rather than doing that, the United States government chose to actually go forward with the surge, which was less successful as a military operation than had been hoped. And the hope was, by going forward with the surge, we would then be negotiating from a position of power and greater strength inside of Afghanistan. And the Taliban would then be forced to accept our terms for peace. And of course, it didn't play out that way. But I think this was a potential moment for greater coercion on our part. And the last opportunity that I would cite, and there have probably been others, but the last one I would cite as an opportunity for coercion came after the United States government killed Osama bin Laden inside of Pakistan. And of course, as you'll remember, we found Osama bin Laden hiding in a compound not far from one of Pakistan's military academies. We found him in kind of odd and challenging circumstances to explain if you were the Pakistani state and you had said that you were working with the United States for over a decade to try to find him, and there he was right inside of Pakistan. And of course, we found and killed him without telling the Pakistani government first, largely because, almost entirely because we didn't trust that they could keep that secret and that they might actually ruin the operation if we had shared news of it ahead of time. But once that happened, the humiliation of the Pakistani state, and particularly of the Pakistani army and air force, the military writ large, the intelligence forces, was extreme. I was in Pakistan at the time. I remember the mood, and they were very much on edge. They felt like they had been humiliated in front of the world, in front of their own people, unable to explain what had happened, both in terms of bin Laden being there on their territory and the US ability to extract or to kill and extract him without them knowing about it or being able to do anything about it. All of this put them on the back foot, so to speak, and would have been an opportunity for the United States to push even harder, to threaten them that if they didn't come clean on the Taliban and other connections with international terrorists, then we really would push them possibly to the point that the Pakistani state would have been in jeopardy. But we didn't do that. And one of the reasons I think that the US government refrained from pushing the envelope at that moment relates to the earlier point I made, that this was a risky thing, that the Pakistani army, for all its faults, and there are many, and for all the things that it has done to double cross the United States in Afghanistan and elsewhere, the Pakistani army has been seen as a force of stability in the Pakistani state. And there aren't many others. And so to do away with the army might potentially be to bring about a degree of dysfunction and perhaps even collapse inside of Pakistan that would have been very dangerous. So these are all the things that went wrong, why we didn't get what we want from the Pakistanis over the past 20 years. And so that brings me to the third question, and the last question that I'll wrap up with, which is, what now? We know all this. We've got a frustrating relationship with the Pakistanis. We're not happy with the way that the war in Afghanistan ended. So what should we do from here? Now, in many ways, the war in Afghanistan brings us back to something that looks almost like the 1990s, when the Taliban were in charge, when there was a potential for Afghanistan to be a magnet for international terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. The same is true today. We have to be concerned about a resurgent Al-Qaeda 2.0 or an ISIS evolution of ISIS inside of Afghanistan, and perhaps Afghanistan drawing new groups of jihadists to its territory. So all this is a problem. And the experience of the past 2 decades gives us very little reason, gives the Biden administration very little reason to trust that Pakistan will be a good and helpful partner. But it also gives the Biden administration few good options for dealing with the terrorist threat inside of Afghanistan. We no longer have bases in Afghanistan or intelligence operatives, at least no compound, no embassy that's operable, no CIA station that is functional inside of Afghanistan. We are forced to contemplate this counterterror challenge from, as they say, over the horizon. And Afghanistan being landlocked, when you look around at what the horizon offers, it's Central Asia with a heavy Russian influence. It's Iran, where we enjoy a terrible relationship, and it's Pakistan. And then further afield into the Arabian Sea, which still requires airspace access, probably over Pakistan. So we don't have great options. And for its part, Pakistan is not happy with us, but also feels like it's been vindicated, that everything it said would happen in Afghanistan has happened, and it's happened roughly the way that it suggested it would. And therefore, Pakistan sees even less reason to cooperate with the United States on American terms. And I think more reason to believe that it actually read the situation in Afghanistan correctly. So my recommendation going forward, and where I think is likely the United States will focus in its relations with Pakistan, is to narrow them, and to narrow them considerably to areas where we have our highest priorities. And as I said before, our highest priorities in the region are terrorists with global reach, including in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan, and Pakistan's nuclear program, which has great potential to be an even larger problem. We've just heard about the death of the nuclear scientist Abdul Qadir Khan, AQ Khan, a Pakistani, father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, so to speak. And this reminds us of the problem of nuclear proliferation that stemmed from Pakistan in the 1990s and early 2000s and was hopefully put to bed, but could be a problem going forward. And of course, we're always worried about the potential for a nuclear conflict between Pakistan and India. So these are our focal points. In Afghanistan, we will have some near-term problems, humanitarian relief problems, refugee problems, where Pakistan may or may not play a very helpful role. And we need to be realistic about how little impulse Pakistan feels to be helpful and how much greater incentive they have to try to find a working relationship with the Taliban, their next door neighbor now, and their proxy, who they would like to continue to be able to work with going forward to solve their own problems. They also have threats of terrorists based inside of Afghanistan who have attacked Pakistan. And the Pakistanis would like to work with the Taliban to fight those groups, the TTP or the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban. These are groups that threaten Pakistan itself, that Pakistan would like to be able to attack inside of Afghanistan and wants to be able to work with the Afghan Taliban to do so. So there are going to be a subset of counterterror problems that the United States might actually be able to work with Pakistan on. So ISIS, a threat to the United States, generally also a threat to Pakistan. Perhaps we can cooperate there. Al-Qaeda, generally clearly a threat to the United States, generally seen as a second order threat to Pakistan as well. Perhaps we can cooperate there. This group of Pakistan or anti-Pakistan Taliban, the TTP, as I said, who are fighting against Pakistan, clearly a threat to Pakistan. Maybe we can help them to target these groups and their operations inside of Afghanistan. So there's a narrow basis of continued counterterror cooperation with Pakistan going forward, even though we know we disagree more broadly, strategically, in terms of the threat that other groups, other terrorist groups in the region may pose to us or to India or to Afghanistan itself. We're not on the same side as the Pakistanis there. And so we shouldn't believe this to be a sort of a rebirth of a strategic partnership of the sort that we might have wanted years ago. So we can work with them on those and not on others. And then on the nuclear issue, I think there we need to recognize that in the past, we were worried about the safety and security of Pakistan's nuclear program. We even went so far as to provide millions of dollars of assistance to Pakistan's nuclear program to try to secure it against potential threats, particularly terrorist threats. That is unlikely to have any space now in terms of because of the deterioration in our relationship with Pakistan, but also because Pakistan has become an ever closer partner with China. And China and Pakistan have worked exceptionally closely on nuclear programs, on missile programs. And so there's not a lot of space there for US cooperation. But we're still worried about Pakistan's nuclear program. And we're particularly worried about them building it up too rapidly or undertaking increasingly risky behavior, especially with respect to India, and potentially building nuclear capable missiles that extend their range as far as other US allies like Israel. And so we're worried about what Pakistan may be doing there. And so there, I think we need to keep up and focus on coercive measures and deterrent measures, effectively threats, to keep Pakistan from taking steps that would be dangerous to us. And we need to be working on building up the credibility of those threats. So it's clear to Pakistan, beyond any shadow of doubt, that were they to take these exceptionally risky steps, that we would respond to them accordingly, and that we have the capability to do so. So it's not a happy story, but I think it's something that we need to focus on. I'll wrap up now just simply by saying that, you, Don, I think opened with a number of quotes from some more sympathetic perspectives on Pakistan, people who believe that, Pakistan has interests, the United States has interests, we need to find areas where we can work together. And I would agree with some of that. But what I've tried to lay out is also the reality that Pakistan has made choices, strategic decisions over the past 20 years that ran very much counter to what the United States might have wanted or did want. And these choices have consequences. We don't need to continue to punish Pakistan for these past decisions, but we also need to recognize there's not a lot of sympathy. There's not a lot of patience for Pakistan, certainly within the Biden administration, where so many officials have worked for so long within the US government or just outside of it, and have seen Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan, and have seen Pakistan as a spoiler and unhelpful partner too many times to see it as someone that they're going to reach out to or prioritize as a partner going forward. So if there is to be a deeper strategic partnership or cooperation or effort at US assistance inside of Pakistan and with Pakistan, it's probably going to have to come from Pakistan's side, them working harder to recultivate these ties going forward, rather than a US outreach, which I see as less likely for all the reasons that I've laid out. So I'll leave it there. I hope I've set the table for a conversation, and I look forward to your questions.
You've not only set the table, but we're ready to eat from it.
Great.
We have a goodly number of questions that have come in through our Q&A, and I encourage people to add more to that list. But a couple of quick questions. One is when you were talking about the F-16s, why would Pakistan want them, in the sense to who do they see that they would be used against?
Right. So the F-16s, it's a great question because there was a lot of different commentary about this all the way through. So from the first basic answer would be Pakistan sees the F-16s principally as a means to address the threat posed by India. And the threat posed by India is that India is a larger, in many ways, more well-endowed militarily power right on its border and has been hostile. Pakistan has seen F-16s as a game changer in terms of air power with respect to India. So the F-16 is a capable fighter jet, especially back in the early 90s when they first wanted them, somewhat less so now, but still quite capable, and the best that Pakistan would have in its arsenal in terms of air power. And so that's point one. Point two would be there has always been speculation since the 90s that Pakistan would be able to re-engineer the F-16s to be nuclear capable. And this would provide Pakistan with another delivery system for its nuclear weapons, its nuclear warheads, in addition to the missiles that it already has. And so, of course, this has been a grave concern to the Indians, who have seen the United States, by selling F-16s to Pakistan, as aiding and abetting the Pakistani efforts to balance India. Last point. When in the post 9/11 era, the United States government sought to justify renewed sales of F-16s to Pakistan, it did not justify them on the basis of helping Pakistan against India. It justified them on the basis of serving as a capable air asset in the counterterrorism fight along Pakistan's border with Afghanistan, and brought, in particular, and this seems at the first a bit laughable, and in some ways still is, but the F-16s were outfitted with very capable targeting for bombs, for bombing raids, far beyond anything else the Pakistanis had in their arsenal. And so as you know, in the early 2000s, certainly as I was watching, we received a number of briefings from Pakistani Army and Air Force officers who would basically show us grainy video feeds of targeting terrorist compounds along their border with Afghanistan and blowing them to smithereens in ways that their ground forces and other air assets couldn't do. And so they did portray the F-16s also as a counter-terror tool or asset. So those are the reasons why they wanted them.
Aha. And it was interesting that they're supposedly fighting the Taliban on their borders at the same time they were encouraging them.
Well, so they were, you know, we should be clear, they were fighting some and killing others, and as a messy mess. And you know, and some of the language that the Pakistanis would use would further confuse a lot of Americans. They would say, "We are at war against terrorists ourselves. We are, of course, not helping the Taliban. The Taliban are attacking us.
Yes.
But the reality was that it was different Taliban, different terrorists, and they were attacking some and aiding others.
Yeah. One of the interesting questions I'm trying to put together here is the Kashmir and how important that is to Pakistan and India, both. And at the same time, what is the US's involvement, if any, in that borderland between India and Pakistan? It seems to many of us to be a very important part of this whole debate, is that India recently did away with many freedoms in Kashmir.
Yeah, and you and I and our guests could have another hour on Kashmir, or you could bring in someone who follows the ins and outs of the Kashmiri story much more closely than I do. The way I'll try to be brief and simple about this, but Kashmir is both a symptom and a cause of the India-Pakistan hostility. It is a cause because both sides, both India and Pakistan and the Kashmiris themselves, disagree on how the place should be governed. And as you noted, over the past couple of years, India has changed the way that the place is governed, at least parts of it, under Indian control, and brought it into more central control by the Indian state, whereas it had enjoyed a degree of greater political autonomy. Now it's under more direct control by the central Indian government. And it has also locked down the area. So that's the Indian move of late. The Pakistanis also don't like where the lines have been drawn on Kashmir, believing that parts of Kashmir that are held by India ought rightly be held by Pakistan. And the Kashmiris, many of them, when they've been polled, and it's difficult to get a poller in these days, but when they've been asked, they've often wanted greater autonomy and to basically be left alone by both India and Pakistan. So you ask, what's the US interest here? Mainly, the United States would like everybody to knock it off and get along and find a peaceful means to settle their differences. And that's been quite difficult. And so as a consequence, the real thing the United States has been worried about repeatedly is crisis management when they come to blows over Kashmir. When India and Pakistan come to war or near war, the United States has tried to resolve or to manage those crises more successfully. And so that's all that, in terms of what we want from the area. But coming back to my first point, it's not just a cause of India-Pakistan anger, it's a symptom. India and Pakistan themselves have unresolved differences at the national level that are not just related to this territorial dispute. You could solve Kashmir tomorrow, and you would still have India-Pakistan differences. And the simplest way to say that would be Pakistan is an insecure state. It believes that its identity was forged in opposition to India, that India is a predatory, larger power on its border, and that it will not be safe unless it can basically resolve that asymmetry. And in many ways, that asymmetry is not resolvable. India, for its part, feels that Pakistan is a problematic neighbor that keeps attacking it, sending terrorists across the border to kill innocent Indians. And so therefore sees Pakistan as a unresolvable problem, doesn't have the military or economic tools to solve Pakistan, but also not a neighbor that it can just deal with peacefully or normally.
Yeah.
So that's the mess that we face.
People are asking, well, could you expand a little bit more on the China relationship? They're asking such things as about the Belt and Road projects, for example, and also about just general relationships with China, because China, of course, is fighting with India over its borders high up in the mountains. And the issue that's coming on the newspapers recently between, getting back to the India relationship, is, of course, that Pakistan seems to believe, and maybe it's right, that Bangladesh would not exist without the support and encouragement of India. So, there are many things going on around us, but I should get back to China, where a goodly number of questions deal with that relationship.
Right. So China and India and Pakistan, another potential hour-long lecture.
We've already asked you to come back to
Right.
talk about your new love for India. So we'll see.
Yeah. So I guess the short way of telling this story would be the China-Pakistan relationship dates back decades and is in part inspired by their mutual concerns about India. So they have a shared frustration with India, Pakistan hostile to India, China seeing India as a large and potentially troubling or troublesome neighbor. And so by the early 60s or mid 60s, shortly after the 1962 war between China and India, which China won decisively, China and Pakistan, because of those shared interests, began to come together. And that decades-long relationship has mainly focused on security issues, and as I explained before, included Chinese assistance to Pakistan's nuclear program, Pakistan's conventional military program, and Pakistan has a lot of other jets, for instance, other than American jets, and a number of them have been made by the Chinese and joint or co-production agreements with the Pakistanis. And that's probably the direction they're going into the future. So Chinese and Pakistanis, tight military to military ties, again, for decades. What has changed over the past 10 years is that those relations have extended into the economic sphere. And China, one of your questioners asked about the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the initial, what was described as a flagship effort in the Belt and Road Initiative was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where the Chinese promised billions of dollars of investment and assistance to Pakistan to build out Pakistan's own infrastructure. Now, all of this should be fairly unobjectionable from an Indian perspective, that part about the infrastructure development in Pakistan, if not for the fact that part of the connection, the land border connection between China and Pakistan goes over territory through the Himalayan mountains that India claims is actually rightfully a part of India and not a part of Pakistan. And so China is investing in and building in parts of Pakistan that India claims for its own. And of course, as another of your questioners noted, the India-China relationship has become increasingly fraught because they're contesting their own borders, land borders all across their land boundary, and have even come to blows over the past couple of years there. So tensions rising between India and China, closer ties between China and Pakistan on a number of levels, and closer ties between the United States and India is creating a situation in South Asia, which is increasingly being described as bloc politics, with India, US, China, Pakistan, two opposing blocs in the region. And the challenge there is that this could be very messy, very dangerous, very quickly. An India-Pakistan conflict or crisis that turns into a conflict that could go nuclear has the potential to draw in even China and then the United States. Now we're talking about things that really keep people up at night. So, watch this space, yeah. I would say, but the Chinese involvement in the region is important and becoming more so.
Can you talk a little bit about the future now with the new Biden administration's views towards Pakistan in particular, because that's the subject for today. But
yeah, I mean, I was getting at this at the end of my talk was the extent to which the narrowing of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship.
Yes.
And maybe I should just say, this is in comparison to, say, the Obama administration or even the Bush administration before that, which had a broad and expansive set of aims for Pakistan. And they included military to military, intelligence cooperation, trying to build those out, as well as civilian assistance. I mean, billions of dollars in U.S. civilian assistance to Pakistan, development assistance, political ties, high-level summit meetings, and so on. And the goal there was to, at some point, people talked of a transformative US-Pakistan relationship in which Pakistan would come to both understand and appreciate that the United States was a partner, a power that could be worked with closely, and could bring Pakistan forward, help it to modernize, to develop, to grow its economy, to become more democratic, to really blossom in a number of important ways. And most of that did not work, or at least it didn't work nearly as well as people had hoped. And it came at a reasonably high price tag, at least from an American perspective. From the Pakistani point of view, the Americans became an unwelcome guest, and they didn't see that our assistance was worth accepting. And particularly after the bin Laden raid and associated irritations, the United States was very present inside of Pakistan, very active inside of Pakistan, ways that made many Pakistanis uncomfortable and angry. Remember our drone campaign, for instance. A lot of Americans didn't pay that much attention to it, but at times we had, hundreds of drone strikes inside of Pakistani territory annually. And these were, probably often killing terrorists, but sometimes they were killing other people as well. And that kind of undeclared war inside of another country, obviously has the potential to create anger and irritation. And there were other things as well. So anyway, that was the expanded version of the US-Pakistan relationship. Now, the Biden administration, including the president himself, lived through that. They were a part of that. He was the vice president. He saw all of that. And he also got very, very frustrated and angry with Pakistan, I think, directly, particularly because of finding bin Laden there, but many other things as well, including Pakistan's relatively unhelpful effort in Afghanistan, as I've outlined. And so now the Biden administration, I think, is filled with people who have kind of had enough with Pakistan. And if I had to guess what President Biden thinks of Pakistan, I think he has no patience, no trust, and no confidence. And to put a finer point on it, it's been widely reported, at least in Pakistan, that the president has yet to speak with the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Biden's been in office for some time now. He's spoken to most world leaders, or many world leaders. He certainly had every reason to reach out to the leader of Pakistan, given all that's happened and unfolded in Afghanistan, and yet has not had time on his agenda to speak with the Prime Minister. I think this reflects, this is a clear signal that the Biden administration does not see a broader and positive agenda in its relationship with Pakistan, but wants to see a more narrow and focused agenda, particularly on terrorism and on Afghanistan. And if Pakistan delivers, maybe more will be on the table. But for now, I think that's about the most that we can expect.
At this time in our previous speakers, and now Mal illuminates his camera because he has a couple of comments and questions to do, I'm sure. Mal, speak up.
Dan, you talked about the narrowing of the focus. That was a summary of your formal presentation. And yet, as we go through the Q&A, it seems to me that the focus broadens. And I know you can't cover everything. Not you just will. Nobody can cover everything completely. But there seems to be, in addition to the military and security, a whole set of commercial and diplomatic issues between where Pakistan comes on board and where China comes into play. When you were with us in February, we talked about China building a port for Pakistan at their request. We talked about the Belt and Road, promises or not promises, where at least there's been a lot of money spent, where it's been influential. Where does that piece fill out, particularly since we have been, quote, thinking about rebalancing toward Asia, as bringing China to the fore, and here's Pakistan as one of the pieces?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is what makes Pakistan so challenging, because just as I'm talking about a narrowing of the agenda, you're absolutely right to recognize that Pakistan is much more than that. And its place on the sort of the geopolitical map, or its place in terms of the human development agenda. Remember, Pakistan has over 200 million people, very young population, many in poverty, needing better education and everything else. And Pakistan is sort of important in other ways, potentially in terms of climate change, its focus on the use of coal, and so on and so on and so on. So there are so many ways in which Pakistan matters. And the title of my book on U.S.-Pakistan relations was "No Exit from Pakistan," meaning we're locked in this relationship that's unacceptable in many ways to both of us, and yet we're still stuck with each other. And for the moment, I think, that's why I say for the moment, I think a narrowing of our focus is all that we should expect and all that we should aim for. But and the questioners are absolutely right that over time, it's not like Pakistan's going to go away. So we have to be thinking about the longer term consequences of where Pakistan may fit in. Now, we're thinking about Pakistan in terms of China's broadening role in continental Eurasia, and the port that you mentioned, Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea, has the potential over time to be a strategic opportunity for China's overland access to the Arabian Sea and from there to the Persian Gulf, which is meaningful for the Middle East, for access to its energy supplies. So Pakistan will matter in these ways as well. I guess my feeling, though, would be you gotta live in the now, and in the now for the Biden administration, it's the narrower focus. But you've also got to think about the longer term, and then the question there would be: is Pakistan's relationship with China, which, as I said before, is tightening, is that a threat to us? Is that worrisome to us? Is that something that we should be pushing against? And for me, at the moment at least, the answer is not really. Not really. It has the potential in the fullness of time to extend Chinese reach militarily and so on. But this is decades away in any real sense. And what would that really do for us? That's not that threatening anyway. So we shouldn't be overheated about it. And the reason I caution that is because I've had a number of Pakistani diplomats and Pakistani analysts and so on try to position themselves as, well, aren't you, the United States, nervous about Chinese influence? Shouldn't you come and give us stuff to keep the Chinese from winning us over? Suggesting that Pakistan is a sort of a prize to be haggled over between Beijing and Washington. And that's exactly where we don't want to be. Sort of outbidding the Chinese for the love of the Pakistanis. It's not worth it, first of all. And it's generally a bad game plan for our efforts in terms of competing with China overall. Definitely don't want to be, and I think I said this in the last time I visited, we don't want to be competing with the Chinese on their own terms, trying to do for Pakistan what the Chinese are already doing. If the Chinese are willing to build out Pakistan's infrastructure, great. If that serves Pakistan's economic development, that's the kind of thing that we were trying to do. If they're more effective at it, good, let them. If Pakistan's economy can grow, great. Now, what the Pakistanis are learning on their own is that dealing with China is not so easy. And there's been increasing frustration with the Chinese and some grumbling about the way that the Chinese invest in Pakistan in ways that help Chinese and don't necessarily help Pakistan. So there's irritation growing there as well. And we can provide over time alternatives to that, commercial, private sector investment that may be more attractive to the Pakistanis over time. That's the kind of way that we should think about the longer term competition. But it's a fantastic question. As you can tell, it's the kind of thing that I worry as our policy toward a country like Pakistan waxes and wanes, that we kind of we swing to one side of the extreme and then swing back, and we never find a kind of a sustainable middle ground. And that's where we should be aiming for. But at the moment, that's going to be really tough.
one questioner has come up with asking you to expand a little bit on the relationship between Iran and Pakistan.
That's an interesting one because obviously they're neighbors. They share a land border. There has been some contention over that border, but not nearly as much as Pakistan has had with Afghanistan. Some of the contentious issues have to do with the people who have traditionally lived in that part of Pakistan and Iran. This is called Balochistan, and it's often been described as a restive and somewhat violent part, sparsely populated, fiercely tribal, and an area where there's been a lot of smuggling and other illegal activities that make it a difficult place to control from any central authority. So both Pakistan sees some of the groups that are opposed to the Pakistani state have launched attacks from the Iranian side of the border, and Iran has seen that some of the groups opposed to the Iranian state have launched attacks from the Pakistani side of the border. So in that respect, it looks a little like Afghanistan. But in most other ways, I would say we've seen a kind of a warming in the relations between Pakistan and Iran in the recent past. And in particular, some of this may be related to the fact that both of them have gotten closer to China. And as China has gotten closer to Pakistan, and China has also cut some big deals with the Iranians, even just over the past year. I've seen a lot of news about this, some of it overblown, overstated, but it's clear that the Chinese and Iranians are trying to do business together, in part because Iran has no great options other than China. Certainly doesn't have us as it pursues its nuclear program, doesn't have the Western Europeans. So Chinese look quite important to Iran. So as China becomes closer to both Pakistan and Iran, Pakistan and Iran have had to patch up some of their differences. One last point on this has to do with sectarianism, something I haven't talked about. But Pakistan is majority Sunni Islam, minority Shia Islam. Iran, of course, is the opposite, a majority, vast majority Shia. That has often created some tensions with Pakistan, given the Iranian support to Shiites in the Middle East and in Pakistan. And Pakistan has also historically had very close ties with Saudi Arabia, of course, seen as a backer of Sunni groups around the world. And so Pakistan, for a time, less so at the moment, but materially, even over the past decade, has been an area of proxy battles between Iranian-backed Shia organizations and Saudi-backed Sunni organizations. Extremists on both sides have basically gone to war in Pakistan's streets, particularly in big cities like Karachi. So Pakistan has seen Iran as a partially a problematic neighbor for that reason as well. So those are the big points in the relationship.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
I want to bring this session to a close. We've sort of run out of time, but I want to thank Daniel for his sharing with me the essay he wrote on Pakistan that wrote recently, and he used sort of as the basis for his talk today, because I found that essay, which you used, as we now know, it is inclusive. It dealt with the three issues that you brought up again today. And I thought it was quite brave, really, at this moment in time when you got a new administration, maybe looking outwards for things to do, because you do criticize the past and you do offer some ways forward. And that's why I thought it was brave doing both those things. And I'm pleased you brought that bravery today to us. Yeah. And I do appreciate, first of all, as I said earlier, for your coming to our rescue today. And secondly, for being who you are and presenting the issues of Pakistan and its neighbors in a clear and inclusive and understandable way. Thank you, Daniel Markey, for that.
Thank you, Don. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you again, and it was fun to join you just as the last time. Great questions, great audience, and thank you.
Yeah. Mal, over to you.
Dan, would you give us one more time the citation of the article so that those of us who want to go through?
Sure, yeah, it's in on Foreign Affairs website, and Pakistan, sorry, America's Perennial Pakistan Problem, Foreign Affairs. It came out in early last month.
Great. Well, we thank you, Dan, for joining us again. We hope, as we said early in the green room, that you will join us again shortly in your new role, focusing on India, China, and other areas that are going to become very important to us. I thank Don for his moderating and for his recruiting you in the first place and in the second place and maybe in the third place. So that's all we thank Joan and her colleagues at the library who make all of this possible. And of course, we thank all of those of you who join us every other week. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Ambassador Mark Grossman, who joined us in the spring with a colleague. We're going to talk about U.S. diplomacy, the diplomatic service for the 21st century. If we can't execute well, all of this wonderful stuff ain't going to make a hell of a lot of difference. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. And be well and be safe. Joan, thanks again.